So today we're going to talk about varieties of welfare states. Welfare states differ across the world, not just in their size, but in the kinds of things they try and accomplish. And so we're going to have a look at the different kinds that we can observe. Now, there's two different sort of explanations as to why we have the welfare states that we do. View number one comes from Hall and Soskis. This is the Varieties of Capitalism literature that is cited in your textbook, and I gave you an optional reading on. Here the view is that welfare states arise and are complementary to different forms of economic organization. So liberal market economies have very limited welfare states because they depend on people getting back to work. That is to say, they need to encourage flexible labor markets. That's part of their competitive and comparative advantage in international trade, is to have flexible labor markets and an ability to adjust very quickly to economic conditions. And what that means is ultimately people need to get back to work quickly, and in order to incentivize that, you don't want to give them large welfare checks. Coordinated market economies, on the other hand, have more generous welfare systems, and in part, the Varieties of Capitalism literature suggests, that's because they have to compensate skilled workers for specialization and for the disadvantages of being forced to collectively bargain. So it's not always true that joining a union is great for all workers. It's generally pretty good for unskilled workers, and in some cases, if they're in the same union as skilled workers, then the highest skilled workers sometimes lose out as some of their wage gains are redistributed to their unskilled fellow workers. So again, a generous welfare state can help make up for some of these disadvantages of being forced to collectively bargain. It can also make up for that issue of labor specialization, how when the worker has to take the entire risk and reward of specializing, often the worker will not, and so as a result economies will have labor forces that are inefficiently non-specialized, or at least coordinated market economies will. And so if you want to reap the advantages of that, you have to offer more generous welfare benefits in compensation for the risks that you are taking as a worker in over-specializing in a particular profession. View number two, and this is the view from the reading in Haggard and Kaufman, and that's that welfare states are basically enduring legacies of past political economies. That is to say, they're not necessarily things that evolve very quickly, in part because they reflect the normative, that is to say moral expectations of the public, and those moral expectations are often formed over generations, particularly recent generations, and so people essentially demand the level of welfare that they're used to, not the level of welfare that would best complement the economic organization of their country. So basically the public demands what it's used to. Now, when we analyze welfare states, often we think of a welfare state as having three basic pillars. One, a compulsory defined benefit, abbreviated DB. Two, a defined contribution aspect, abbreviated DC, and this is usually attached to one's job. And the third pillar is personal savings, which is largely voluntary but often can be incentivized. And these three things together dictate the total of the welfare package that an individual worker might receive. Let's talk about defined benefits. Defined benefits are programs that guarantee a certain level of income or benefit no matter what. These can be more or less generous, but the key is that these benefits don't depend on your income or your behavior as a person. So this is in those countries that have a basic guaranteed income. France is an example where everybody's, no matter what their previous job status, is entitled to something called the RMI. The RMI in French is an abbreviation for Revenu Minimum Insertiel, and it's basically the minimum revenue that enables you to live and look for a job, roughly. In the United States, we call this a basic income, although the United States does not have a basic income. It has been talked about, and it's a basic level of benefits. It's not conditional on your doing anything, and so that's why it's guaranteed as a defined benefit. So the defined benefits don't only have to be income, right? So for instance, if you have a child, you receive a certain amount of child support no matter what, right? So a defined benefit might be, you get a certain amount of money per month if you have a child. Or in some cases, it might be if you have a child and you are under a certain income threshold, although again, that can vary. But the point is that defined benefits are the kinds of basic guarantees that you often see, particularly in Western Europe, but not just there. Second pillar is defined contribution aspect. And defined contributions are basically when your level of benefit depends on your level of contribution. These are government programs or employer retirement programs that force you basically to contribute a certain part of your income to a pension fund, for example. That's the most common example. And generally, then your benefits are indexed to that contribution. So for instance, if you made a certain amount of money per year, then for a certain number of years, then your benefit will be indexed to your earnings, to what you contributed. And then Social Security in the United States is a perfect example of a defined contribution system. Many retirement programs in many countries are DC. That is to say that richer people get larger payouts and poorer people get lesser payouts based on what they contributed throughout their lifetimes. And finally, the third pillar is personal savings. And personal savings component of the welfare system is not just what you choose to put aside on your own voluntarily, but all the ways the government can encourage individuals to save up for life emergencies. So if you have a job and your job offers a 401k, that's a tax advantage to saving for your retirement. You have a health savings account maybe, that's a tax-free account that enables you to accumulate money for health expenditures in the course of a year. And these incentivize basically people to save and be responsible and take care of themselves in their own retirement. So these three pillars and how deeply any given welfare system relies on each of these pillars just depends on, well, often location in the world. What you see is a certain amount of congruity, that is to say a certain amount of similarities between welfare systems in different parts of the world, and Haggard and Kaufman do a good job of discussing this. So for instance, if you think of Eastern Europe, remember, used to be under communist rule, where the prevailing ideology was that everybody was guaranteed certain basic minimums. And although communism is gone from Eastern Europe for the most part, what remains is that social expectation that people will be taken care of. That hasn't left, and so the democratic states of Eastern Europe that have succeeded communism have nonetheless been forced to provide fairly generous social insurance and coverage because this is what people have come to expect and rely on. And so what you see is universal coverage, which means that everybody is covered regardless of income. What you see is an attempt to also develop a coordinated market economy to kind of take advantage of the fact that people are receiving benefits. What you see is vocational training, and you see also as attempts to guarantee employment. What this means is that labor markets are a little bit less flexible, have a harder time adjusting to changes in market conditions and supply and demand, but on the other hand, more security for workers and more ability for workers to ride out the ups and downs of global markets without having to constantly change jobs and be insecure as a result. In East Asia, you typically have a defined contribution system. You typically don't have much social insurance. What you do have, though, is significant educational investment. So the choice has not been to spend money on fairly generous welfare states, but has been to spend a fair amount of money on trying to get the workforce educated as much as they can, increase levels of human capital, particularly for the purpose of economic production. So whereas, in lots of countries, they tell you to go get an education, go to college, but they don't really tell you what to do. You choose your major, you choose your program. In a lot of East Asian economies, I'm thinking of places like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, largely you are heavily incentivized to go to specific professions where the government has decided, along with business, that there are certain needs to be met. So, for example, if they need a lot of engineers, they're going to heavily incentivize people to go to engineering programs, and they're not going to have much in the way of art schools or music programs or anything like that. The educational system is largely geared towards supporting the economy, and that's the sense in which it's part of the welfare system, in that it prevents people from falling into poverty by giving them human capital that the market wants, right? That's in demand. On the other hand, the downside of this, or the flip side of this, is that labor markets are flexible, which means it's easier to hire and fire people, and you'll have people will experience a little bit more day-to-day insecurity about their job status and about where their next paycheck is coming from, because again, the model here is primarily export-oriented. What that means is that companies are responding to demand and supply, well, primarily demand conditions in other parts of the world. And so if you're exporting for a country that's doing very well, then you're great. If you're exporting to countries that are doing poorly and that aren't demanding your products as much anymore, you could see pretty quick cutbacks. Okay, and finally, the last type of welfare system that is discussed by Haggard and Kaufman is the Latin American system, where you have very unequal coverage. The formal sector, that is to say the legal part of the economy, is defined benefit, where benefits are fairly generous as long as you're working and paying your taxes in the appropriate amounts to your government. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who work in the informal sector in Latin America. That means they work under the table illegally. They don't pay taxes on their income. And though that informal sector is not covered at all by the welfare system. The welfare system basically says if you play by the rules, you can get benefits, but if you don't play by the rules, you won't get any benefits. And so, unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, the informal sector is actually a majority of the economy. A majority of the economy doesn't pay taxes in many Latin American countries. Mexico is a clear example. Brazil, Argentina, all of these are fairly clear examples where you have very, very large informal sectors. The formal sector has generous coverage. The informal sector has none. The formal sector often has some coordinated market economy elements, that is to say some union bargaining at a peak level. Whereas the informal sector is largely an LME and not a particularly well-functioning one. Latin America also tends to have much lower quality education, so not so much in the way of educational investments on the part of the government. The choice has been to, again, provide generous benefits to workers who pay taxes. In the United States, you might call them the aristocracy of labor, so skilled workers. People who have a significant amount of skills are generally well taken care of in exchange for a fairly high tax burden, but the rest of the country is often left to its own devices. Okay, so what do we conclude from all this variation, all these different kinds of welfare systems that have popped up and endured across the world? Well, Haggard and Kaufman point out that there's no real convergence. Just like globalization doesn't seem to encourage much convergence on any particular type of capitalism, it also doesn't seem to encourage convergence on a type of welfare state offered either. A lot of people in the 1990s were worried that globalization would pressure countries to basically stop offering welfare benefits because perhaps that would make the country non-competitive on the global level, and so that would encourage lots of states to sort of dismantle their welfare systems. That didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. Why didn't it happen? Well, that's where people disagree, but one, it could be that the welfare state is much more in demand, given the global market fluctuations. As we've seen most recently in sort of the Great Recession of 2008 to 2011, given that global markets swing up and down, people demand more welfare protection. They demand coverage. They see it as something that's necessary given economic conditions. It could also be that welfare systems, like the Varieties of Capitalism model suggests, can be a way of compensating for various kinds of risks that people take within the market, and so it's not inefficient at all. In fact, it helps produce more efficiencies in some cases to offer more generous welfare benefits within certainly a CME. So again, there's sort of still some things we don't know, right, about what what exactly is driving this divergence or this lack of convergence in welfare systems. It could also be that this is a temporary effect. We will see more convergence later. Like right now, people are demanding more or demanding that the welfare system not change, but as debt accumulates, as people realize that the burden of particularly pension systems becomes overwhelming. We could do an entire lecture on pension systems, quite frankly. I mean, pension systems are sort of the systems that govern retirement compensation in various countries, and many aging countries like the United States and countries in Western Europe and Japan are facing big pension crises because they have not accumulated enough savings to cover all the people who are going to retire and sort of be drawing out in the system. And so that's going to cause probably some tax increases in most Western countries, or benefit cuts, neither of which will be very popular. But again, that's its own lecture. So again, bottom line here, different kinds of welfare systems, not a whole lot of convergence. There's some complementarity between welfare systems and economic and other sort of big political economy type institutions, but it's not as clear, right? That's not completely clear because lots of countries seem to diverge from that from the varieties of capitalism expectation. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know, and otherwise, I will see you in there.